All right, we are good. Good afternoon, good morning, depending what part of the world you are in. Those are watching the recording. Well, you missed it, but you're watching the recording. That's a good thing. My name is Tony Salas. I am the moderator for today for the roundtable. As we got some special discussion that we're going to be talking about. I thought I'd start off. As you know, and I'm sure everybody that's here, we got quite a bit of talent logged on today. And I'm nobody here. But, anyways, what I was going to briefly mention is, as you know, with our current administration and politics, no, we're not going to talk politics, but what's going on is I can't tell you how many YouTube videos are up that seems like a lot of shops are seeing a green light happening to deletes. Have you guys seen that? I mean, just go on many different truck diesel channels out on YouTube and even some of the social media, Instagram, Facebook stuff. It's like that means since the EPA has been laid off so much personnel, can we delete now? And we also see that they're talking about the abolishment of CARB as well. And in other words, we want a free for all. They make it sound, and frankly, it's not that simple, is it? So, one thing I do want you to understand, as and you guys want to kick in your comments, feel free real quick. But since I go work at shops, I go train at shops, the level of understanding of after treatment is sad, honestly sad. In other words, I can't tell you how many shops, they're quick to complain about after treatment. Yes, there are some things I don't like about it. I'm not going to lie to you. But the thing is, the fact that, they did training. So last week I was in Southern California. I did some training for a fleet, and they wanted an advanced class. And I had told one of the people I was working with on there, and I told him, the problem is when they tell you they want training, they seem to say that they know it all and they want some advanced stuff. And I literally taught almost 4.5 hours of basic after treatment because they never had after treatment. Now, these are all veteran technicians and a fleet of 3 different locations that do have these trucks. And it's like, it's kind of sinful. So anyways, what I thought I mentioned, since I've been working on updating my diesel master course online, some things that seem to think that I think about, that we talk about also, is, like I just mentioned, still not trained on after treatment. I mean, come on, after treatment came out back with SER, that is with SER. It came out back in 2011 on light duty vehicles and also all the way to medium duty and HD. We saw the introduction of the DOC and the DPF on those trucks in 2007 and a half, somewhere around there. So therefore, the 2 major emissions that we all know, I'm not going to spend too much time on, is NOx and particulate matter. So that's what, that's what they're trying to crack down on. And as time goes on, yes, those emission requirements. So a thing I always say in classes, and again, if you disagree, let me know. But, when you see manufacturers get caught cheating and fined, that kind of tells you, are they struggling to meet those emission standards? But again, then you talk about the reality of it. In other words, you go to our local places here in Las Vegas, where I'm home based, and you ask them, hey, what do you guys do with all that soot you clean off of those DPFs you service? And then we have ultrasonic cleaning from some of our local cleaners, and you ask them, where's that solution with all that heavy soot going to as well? So keep that in mind. But in this case, we have NOx and DEF fluid. And, when we talk about NOx, it's like, since I was doing a update on, like I said, on my L5P section of my diesel master course, I always talk about NOx, and I ask guys, what is NOx, right? And this is straight from the EPA webpage, believe it or not. And when we say why the X in NOx, right? Well, there's many variables, as you can see just right here on the first page from the EPA's website, describing what is nitrogen oxide, right? But then when I talk to gentlemen, they need to understand that virtually, like it says there, N2, which is nitrogen, makes up of 80% of the air. So when an engine breathes, we actually have quite a bit of nitrogen coming in. In other words, when we inhale, exhale, it's the same thing for an engine. Engine breathes in air. In this case, it is 80% nitrogen. So a lot of guys don't understand that when you reach those operating temperatures, you actually are creating NOx. So, I created this simple little chart showing, again, nitrogen and oxygen being ingested into the engine. And when we reach somewhere around 25, everybody uses 2,500 degrees under literature. It's around 2370. I get it. But this under load, under certain conditions, you are going to attain these temperatures, if not more, in the combustion process. So the big deal that's going on is that as we're dealing with derate issues, as we're dealing with, I mean, the stories I get, and I'm, like I said, I'm silly enough to give my cell phone number, and you should see some of the things I have to deal with. And we're trying to figure out this doesn't make sense, nor does it follow the rules of what we were taught in manufacturer specific classes. Well, the truck, for example, the simplest one I could tell you is that literally the truck had a leak. There was no fluid going to the doser. And in this case, it's just all crystallized underneath that truck from the leak. And this customer never bothered to look underneath the truck, and they're just pouring and pouring and pouring the fluid. So you would think that, okay, you're not reducing NOx, are you? And in this case, there is no DEF fluid being injected, no ammonia to reduce it. So therefore, why was it not in derate? Why was there no code set? So kind of begs the question, what's going on there, right? But the biggest issue that I see in terms of understanding is now more and more I'm getting phone calls about NOx sensor 1. Now, NOx sensor 1 is the one before the SCR assembly starts. So it's saying NOx concentration high. Well, we try to simplify it as best as we can, because if we read literature and also read diagnostic trouble codes, like on a GM size, and I was just working on L5Ps, we're finding out that, hey, you got these NOx concentration codes, what's causing high NOx. So like I've been teaching in my classes, I knew working on these trucks, especially light duty, medium duty trucks, that I was going to come up with a number that dictates that there is too much NOx. Now, again, you guys probably work with your number, but what it is that I came up with 300 parts per million, because that seems to be the highest that before you trigger a NOx concentration based on all the trucks, both here and around here, everywhere. In other words, if I see greater than 300 parts per million, that kind of leads me to believe that we are dealing with too much NOx being created after the combustion process prior to the SCR assembly. So therefore, guys are, putting the puzzle together, and I'm trying to teach that is, okay, when you are looking at NOx concentration 1 code, you need to look at NOx concentration 1 at idle, make sure everything's at operating temperature, everything else is hunky-dory, you've done your basics and your diagnostics, and in this case, where are you with the parts per million on NOx sensor 1? So therefore, are you creating too much NOx, right? Now, again, this is prior to the SCR assembly. So as we're seeing fuel quantity, fuel injector quantity, fuel injector timing codes, everybody's replacing injectors, especially on the L5Ps. That's not fixing the problem, right? So in this case, there's something else going on. In other words, what's the program working for? What's the compression? What is going on in the intake? What's going on in the particulate filter? Maybe it's restricted. It's a big deal going on here. So
Yeah.
I guess what I'm trying to say is there is a lot to keep in mind as we diagnose. So therefore, if you don't do that, you're going to be just all getting upset, saying, I can't fix this truck. I can't get out of derate, blah, 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 blah. So understanding on how it works is very critical here. So because if we don't get it, we're going to have an issue there. So keep that in mind. All right. So with that said, I mean, what do you guys think so far? Any comments on that? I'm taking comments here. We have a mic. Somebody's mic is on. So Mara, you're in the business of just after treatment, are you not?
Yes. Yep. I work with DNX emission, and we focus just on after treatment. So it's, NOx issues. Is the sensor reading accurately? Is the computer reading the sensor accurately? And do you have a condition where you have excessive black smoke? Remove the sensor, look at the tip. Is it covered with soot? If it is, do a snap test to see if you have excessive black smoke coming from your engine, and that could potentially lead you to diagnosing what you have going on causing that increased NOx.
Yeah. One thing that we suggest here in the diagnostic process on these light duty, medium duty trucks is actually uncork the exhaust somewhere around the downpipe, and let's see what the color smoke looks like, right? That's what we're trying to see. So in other words, we have that black smoke, that blue smoke prior to it entering into the whole after treatment, which could cause premature issues with the after treatment system. So
yeah, the ECM can only pick up so much data. So just because you don't have a code telling you, hey, there's a problem within your engine in this area, doesn't mean that you don't have a problem. The computer just can't see it. So having those visual indicators of I have white smoke, blue smoke, black smoke, you would then turn to a symptom-based troubleshooting.
Very good. I gotta like with technical talk though. And so, yeah, that's very good. So, Karl, since you're going to be speaking here a little bit, we're going to give you the floor here in a minute. But what do you guys have been challenged with on the after treatment side?
Well, you kind of almost hit the nail on the head, Tony. You took away a little of my steam that I was going to kind of jump into. But the key is the performance of the engine is the first thing you have to look at to make sure that the engine isn't overfueling or underfueling, causing conditions that are going to affect the after treatment system. That's where we see the biggest effect going on. Is it'll come in with an after treatment problem, components will be replaced, send it back out, and 5,000 miles later, it's back in again with the same concern. And it's real easy to blame the part over again, but second and third time coming back, you got to understand that it could be something else. And performance of the engines is so critical, and it's kind of a dynamic setup on the engines today that they can adjust as they go, but they can only adjust so much and stay within the realm of perfect performance. So cylinder contribution is a great one to look at before you even start fixing an after treatment system.
Correct. So when you see these fleets that I've recently been training and they're just replacing or cleaning DPFs and just complaining, I'm like, yeah, we definitely have DPF issues out there. I'm like, no, what's bombarding the DPF? And even to the day, I still had a crowd not too long ago also that believes in still pouring transmission fluid into the diesel fuel, when the majority of the the majority of the transmission fluid is all synthetic. So it's not the same old Dexron 1 from the old days, the Type A's from the old days. So, but the fact of the matter is, yeah, engine performance is that. So, so my point is, in me bringing this all up, is for those of you that are going to be watching the recording or just live right now, if you're new to this, you need to get up to speed. There is so much out there, even on the YouTubes and the videos out there, training you on, from good people. In other words, talking about the aftertreatment, because they're on the other side. Other shops are in different regions of the United States. I've been traveling, deletes are going like crazy. Even though they've tried to crack down, you can still get a delete program. I can get a delete program if I wanted one. But what I'm trying to say is deletes are not always the answer. And in this case, we have to understand that the manufacturer set forth the programming based on, what that, in other words, what the emission controls installed in it. So when we start seeing deletes, the question I always have asked is, what's the quality of delete that you're using? Because literally some deletes turn off all the codes. There's no codes that will be set. And also it'll affect the drivability, premature engine failure. The truck's running loaded with more boost. That's creating havoc. And it's not surprising to see head gasket failure, if not total, engine failure too as well. So got to be careful about that. So those of you that are viewing this and are new to this and think that, oh, I just want to delete, because I literally see somebody pay $100,000 for a brand new truck, and literally within weeks, they are wanting to delete everything off. And next thing you know, they're out of warranty. And two, they also have major engine failure because of the crap delete program they put in there. So be aware. And also note that a truck, I know we have a horsepower war going on, and some manufacturers like Cummins with Ram, they haven't pursued those numbers of Ford. And in this case, the more you stress that motor with more power, in other words, more boost and fueling, you're actually, working that engine hard. So the question I often ask as we're looking at after treatment, we're looking at the latest horsepower numbers, is how long, or in other words, how many miles are we getting out of these engines? So I've had some shops or some crowds I've taught into that said, 100,000, maybe 150,000. I'm like, for what you're paying for that truck, what's going on is that's kind of a sin. It's like, and the Power Stroke 6.7 seems to be, even though it's vast in numbers, seems to be the number one engine we see premature failure. We see a lot of demand for, and Lee can even chime in on that one because he knew that 6.7 Power Strokes are just sought after from shops because, again, the quantity of failure on them is not funny. In other words, how many miles are we seeing? Under 200,000 in many cases. So it is common that these trucks can attain a very high mileage, but again, how they're driven and how they're deleted. I mean, Lee, you dealt with that for quite a while. Are you still there?
Gotcha, Tony. And it's so true. I don't think I've ever seen a 6.7 get by 200,000 miles
Yeah.
because somebody's out jacking with it.
Yeah, exactly. So therefore, again, maintenance has been a factor, and the quality of the engine running is going to affect all this. So obviously, there's more to the story, but again, we're only going to talk about so much because it does require training. Again, there is so many people out there doing classes, and in this case, you ought to be getting up to speed on what you're looking at with. Because one thing I'm going to be talking about in the future, and Mara, this is probably up your alley, is the understanding of an ammonia slip catalyst. At this time, RAM is the only one that's using an ASC on the big three. I haven't looked at 2025s though. And in this case, ASCs, they don't understand what ammonia slip is, right? So in this case, they're dealing with this, and we got an ammonia sensor along with a particulate sensor, but they're clueless on understanding what an ASC is. So in other words, why are we taking that excess ammonia, as we call ammonia slip? So, and something to keep in mind that some of us are not fully understanding of what's going on with the after treatment. So I can't stress enough. Again, I know I'm repeating myself, and that is that need to get up to date on after treatment. So there are, again, numerous good training out there on that. So Karl, any other comments? Somebody said something.
Tony, Matthew here. Two comments along with the on emissions factor. I know you just stated here already on this call that you're finding that at idle, 300 parts per million of NOx is kind of the cap mark on these trucks. Have we gotten any more data on any, say, new or nearly new trucks on what some of the maximum NOx levels should be on any of all three, or even cruising data, just for reference points for us as we're looking? And I understand there's going to be some variables, but would give us some data even in that way.
I'll be honest with you. Yeah, I'll be honest with you. I haven't kept track on it. I got so many things going on, but when I diagnose a truck, I'm just looking for that reduction. What is it? 75% reduction we're supposed to see on NOx sensor 2. Okay. So therefore that, I can't say. Mara, do you, since you work in this heavily, do you see magical numbers?
No, a lot of times OEMs don't publish those numbers because there's so many variables, right?
Correct.
The only place where there isn't a variable is idle. There's always a standard of this is what it should be at idle. But if you're driving down the road, is it when you're accelerating? Do you have a load? Are you hauling a heavy trailer? Are you hauling a light trailer? Are you going up a hill? There's so many variables that they can't account for. Here's what you need to look for when you're driving and hauling this much weight and pulling a hill. This is what the spec should be. The computer is just programmed to say, well, if we see a problem, we're going to trip a code.
There you go.
That's why a lot of the tests are done at idle, because at idle, you don't have variables.
Correct. The other question, Tony, is, pardon me, checking for NOx level. I know back a while you said the only way we could actually verify something like this was like with a 5-gas analyzer. Is there any other equipment that's become available that we can actually could purchase to kind of tailpipe check NOx levels to compare if NOx sensors or NOx reduction is actually accurate?
The only thing I've talked to the South American and Australian and European connections that I have, and yeah, they are using 5-gas analyzers, but or just a NOx analyzer is now available. But no, I haven't. I mean, Mara, I'm bugging you once again.
No, I mean, you could probably remove the DEF doser, and if there is no DEF getting dosed into the system, your inlet and outlet NOx sensors should read almost the exact same thing. On the heavy duty side, Detroit has a specific test called a low temp ATD, where you remove the DEF doser and it simulates a regen, and your NOx sensors should be within 50 parts per million of each other. So I think that as a standard across any diesel engine, I don't know why you couldn't take the DEF doser out, put it in a container so it's dosing DEF into a container instead of into the decomposition tube or mixing chamber, and your inlet and outlet NOx sensor, you don't maybe want to force a regen, but it's sitting there at idle, your NOx sensor should be about within 50 parts per million because you're not dosing DEF.
Good point. That's a good tip, Mara. Thank you. Never thought of that.
And Tony, I'll chime in on Matt's question. In the PCED and the Ford Workshop Manual, you've got PIDs that give you ranges at idle, 50, and not necessarily WOT, but it gives you 3 ranges. But it's always, Matt, really wide. It won't give you something specific like you're looking for.
Like, man, Matt, Mara's nailed it right on the money. There's too many variables. I mean, honestly, it's too many variables. Now, if you have a consistent temperature and a consistent load, yeah, you could probably start graphing, getting some general ranges, but I leave it to the computer. I'm looking at idle. Like, I agree with Mara. I look at idle, but again, I leave it to the computer to make a decision if there is adequate NOx concentration, because again, he knows those variables. That's what he's programmed to do. So I wish I can give you more numbers, but nope. So
there's
there
nothing stopping you from taking a truck that's a healthy truck that you don't have problems with, monitoring parameters while you're driving it, and saying, okay, there's nothing wrong with this truck. Here's what I'm seeing. The next time the same year, make, model truck is in the shop and it's not, it's fixed, it doesn't have issues, go drive that one and monitor those parameters. And you could make your own, hey, here's a area that it should be in. And if I have a truck with an issue and I'm road testing it and EGR differential pressure is way out of whack from these other 2 that I graphed out myself, and even though you don't have codes, maybe that helps send you in a direction of where to look. You can do that work yourselves. It's not something Tony or I would have time to create for anyone.
Sure, I understand that. I did here probably about 1.5 years, 2 years ago. We had a LM2 here. It might not have been quite that long ago, where we were fighting a NOx reduction problem, and was kind of this customer had been to the dealership beforehand, and they weren't quite sure if they were going to be able to get warranty or not. So I was able to get another donor LM2 and just kind of cross compare the data, and that it was helpful. Definitely was able, once I had another known good truck to compare it, it helped point us in the right direction.
Very good. All righty. All right. So therefore, like I said, the reality of work of a diesel powered vehicle performance is obviously, what's the failure going on? For example, I get a truck that has over 200, 300,000 mile, new customer or new shop I'm working at. And this truck literally has 250. The classic ones here in Vegas are the tow trucks. So this truck has been beaten hell. It probably runs, 2 shifts to 3 shifts. In other words, it's 24/7 truck here in Vegas. They're tore up pretty good. And you got all these codes set. So yeah, we see engine issues. We see, excessive carbon issues, and we see other, and who knows what kind of fuel they're running. I go to other areas where they're running a bio of some kind, and that doesn't help situations either sometimes. But obviously that affects, overall the fuel economy. I mean, some of these trucks are getting like 7 miles per gallon, and it's so bad. So obviously I've talked about blow-by in the past, how it seems to be accepted and it's not okay. Blow-by is our #1 enemy of DPF. And in this case, if everybody thinks that crankcase filter is going to filter 100% of that oil that might be in the blow-by, and that's not the case. And in this case, guys said, well, it's got a lot of blow-by. It's got to be the crankcase ventilation filter. Who's the source of that blow-by? It could be increased, yes, by a restricted, CCV. But in this case, we see blow-by. In other words, the oil change intervals are so bad, they don't account hours for the amount of miles. In other words, if it sits there with a PTO running all the time. And then, we see the EGR issues along with, again, like I just mentioned, the engine oil being affected. So I guess what I'm trying to say, there's too much going on, but like Karl mentioned, is the engine is very important to be running at optimum levels. So in this case, more than ever, when we sum it all up, when it comes to a engine with after treatment, is maintenance is the key. We've been talking about it. And I love those YouTube videos where they're throwing a ball bearing down the oil to see which one falls faster. There's more to that in understanding engine oil. That's why there's chemists that do this stuff. But in this case, again, engine oil change intervals per manufacturers, to me, they're not good enough. And in this case, we've seen it because how that engine is ran is going to affect overall the engine oil life. So like my
Tony?
professor used to say, engine oil does not get wore out. It actually gets overloaded. So
I got a question, Tony.
Go ahead.
If you're talking about blow-by, has anybody figured a way of checking the pressure in the crankcase, what it should be? On cars, it's 1 to 2 inches of vacuum. So is it basically the same on a diesel or not?
Actually, for the longest time, let me step back in time for a second. For the longest time, diesel manufacturers always gave us a blow-by specification. In other words, crankcase, pressure specification. And that's what the water manometer was used. I remember teaching it in my 6.5 days. However, though, even Matthew's here, and Matthew can tell you, Matthew even had a fight with somebody he knew at Ford to try to get a specification for the 6.7, right, Matthew?
Yes, correct.
I remember you talking about that. And in this case, so yeah, we do have manometers available, just like we did before. And yes, there is a spec that we can get out of it. Duramax has a spec, but the one I have only works up to 07. So I've looked it up, and they're not giving you blow-by spec. So, and Ford hasn't. Correct me if I'm wrong, Matt. I know you're up to date on that. Did Ford finally give a formal spec for the crankcase pressure?
So I did get one out of a Ford rep, and I'd have to go back and pull the notes again.
Yeah.
I will say this to Jim in relation to that. I do know the 6.4 spec just by looking over in the past. And what they were saying was you had to get the engine up to operating temperature over 156 degrees at 3,300 RPM for at least 3 minutes. And you were not to be over 10 inches of water column, which if you do the math, I think is what, 5 PSI? Is that, I think I'm reading that correctly. So that's significant, but obviously wore out engines, we see a whole lot more than that. And the 6.7, I'd have to go back and try to pull that spec, but it is actually pressure, not vacuum on the diesel side.
That's always pressure, yeah. In inches of water.
The other day we did one, and we took a pressure pulse sensor and put it on the crankcase. We found out we had a couple of cylinders that were not doing a good job. So that's why I was bringing up the issue.
I missed the vacuum gauge on those gasoline engines to see what's going on with the valve train.
Yeah, well, the pressure pulse sensor, you can go to the crankcase, like the first look sensor, you can go to the crankcase and do a test on it. So I was doing a couple of diesels after doing some cars, and we had one that you could see there was a couple of cylinders that were having an issue. And that's why I was asking. So it is pressure, not vacuum. That's why I wanted to know.
Yeah, we had fun. I have a pressure pulse tester, and we had a truck at a shop that I was working at, and it actually had the big bump sound where it's obvious it's a rocker arm broken. I go, let me grab this pulse tester and let's look at this. I got to see how this looks like on the pulse, and it's like one major, line right there on the pulse. So it was pretty cool. So yeah, I've been shooting clips for that because I'll be doing my version of pressure pulse testing too. So very good. All righty. Did that answer your question, Mr. Wilson? Mr. Wilson?
It did.
All righty. All right. Karl, where'd Karl go?
I'm here.
I'm going to stop the share. Did you want to put your PowerPoint up there? Are you going to share it?
Yeah. I want to talk. I'll talk on a few comments to begin with. If just to get going here, so many areas we just covered. Of course, I'm trying to think of response to every one of those that we covered. The first one I want to talk about is delete kits. And in my theory is if the diesel truck is driven correctly and maintained properly, that after-treatment system, I feel, should last the longevity of the vehicle other than servicing the DPF, of course. A lot of times what happens is the delete kits start adding more fuel than desired. And I've heard this from so many people that own diesels, and a lot of these are knowledgeable people that say, hey, I put a delete kit on my vehicle. Not only do I get better mileage, but I have more power. So that's kind of an oxymoron to me, and somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but to get more power out of a diesel, you give it more fuel. So I think what happens is they get fooled by this little mileage counter that's on the dashboard of the vehicle to say you're getting, instead of 18, you're getting 26 miles to the gallon with your delete kit installed. Well, the problem with that is only based off two things, speed and load. So speed's constant. We know that's the same. And where do we get our load from? We get it from our accelerator pedal. So now you're giving it more fuel, so you're not stepping on the pedal as far. You're kind of fooling this computer into saying you're getting better mileage. And all in all, you're giving it more fuel with less throttle in it. So it's kind of an oxymoron. But the trouble is with the delete kits, you're giving it more fuel. So, you know, you're burning more fuel with it. And unlike people think they're getting better mileage, they're really not with a diesel engine. So go back to how a diesel's being driven and maintained. Myra kind of coined in on a few key topics. How is that diesel being driven? I have a neighbor that just bought a diesel 6.7 Ford. It's probably a 14 or 15, great condition, but he's using it for a grocery getter or a soccer, you know, mom type of vehicle. And those vehicles are made to be pulled under load. And that's really what a diesel's made for. And it's made to be driven on a regular basis. One of the biggest factors we have out there is the fuel. And you mentioned that too as well, Tony. The fuel that we're getting today is far than superior in this country than we really deserve for our diesels. And the biggest issue we have is the bio that's added to the fuel. And it's not actually the bio that causes the problem. It's the aging process that happens when you put bio into the fuel. The more bio, the shorter age life it has. And I mean, it cuts it down considerably. So if you're running the diesel constant at the heavy loads and you are using biofuel, probably won't hurt that truck much at all. The problem is people that let the diesel vehicle sit for a long length of time with that fuel in the tank and don't really burn it. So that's another thing that I like to add to that and what we're talking about. Let me try to share my screen here if I can.
Yeah, so as Karl's sharing his screen, yeah, that is a never-ending topic. I've posted some stuff on my YouTube channel talking about that. Fuel is not consistent, so not consistent at all. So,
hey Tony, have you heard of, or anybody out there heard of the renewable, the R100, the hydro-treated vegetable oil?
I actually did a whole presentation on the Lucas channel sponsored webinar I did. Yeah, I did a whole thing on the Lucas on there. I'll send you a link to that if you'd like to see it. I did my research, made a lot of calls. That was pretty interesting. But R99, so it doesn't look actually it's pretty good, very good actually. But the fact that we see some independent associations trying to give you a, you know, what's that one that's sold from Costco? I can't remember. God, I just did a presentation on that, where it's actually certified, branded, good. In other words, good oil, good fuel. Because when you buy fuel, you're at the mercy of whatever you're getting, you know. So
yeah, and that's the problem. And you go to a fuel station, you buy diesel out of that pump. How long has it been sitting in their tanks before you get it into your vehicle? You know, one of the best places to get it is a high volume diesel station. So you know the diesel fuel's moved quite often and it doesn't sit in those tanks very long. So that's probably the best thing to do. And a lot of times what happens too is a slow moving station might have, you know, 500, 600, 700 gallons left in that tank that's 3 or 4 months old. That's partly bio. And then they add to that and it just contaminates that whole extra, all that fuel they put into that tank. It contaminates that load of fuel as well. So you're buying diesel fuel unknowingly, not at a good quality. So that's another thing that happens as well. But from the Bosch standpoint, we only will warranty anything up to 5% bio. Anything after that, it's on the manufacturer's responsibility for anything higher than that. So like the Ford Super Duties, they advertise B20, anything over 5%, any warranty comes back, it's on Ford.
okay.
Karl, question for you on that. I know back a while when one of the other, I think it was Standardine or someone had done some independent testing on fuel. They were telling, and this was my understanding, that any fuel handler that handles fuel from the time it is refined till it gets to the delivery, whether the rack or whatever, can add up to B5 per place that they put it in. And it potentially, by the time you receive it, could be B20 or more, but still marked as B5. Do you know if that's actually still accurate or not?
So I know it's fuzzy math, Matthew, and that's kind of what you're alluding to. I do know I've spoke to people just recently, actually, that had a relative of theirs that worked in the refinery, and he was in charge of, you know, mixing the diesel fuel at the end stage. And before it goes on that truck or as it's going into the truck, they can add whatever they want into that. Now it says a lot of pumps will say, up to 10% biofuel, but who's ever going to be able to measure that and see how much biofuel's in that unless it's in a lab? You really don't know. So you're right. It could be B10, B15, B20. So on another subject, I used to live up in Massachusetts, and we used oil for our oil burner to heat the home. And there was one year when diesel, fuel oil went up really high, including diesel fuel, $4 or $5 a gallon. You probably all remember back in 08 and 09. Well, I had to service the filter in my furnace like every 30 days. And when you pulled it out, it looked like fish eggs consistency coming out of that filter. Once the biofuel went away, you only service that filter every 2 years. So if that tells you anything about what that does to the fuel, it's not a good process when you're trying to fit fuel at high pressures through these tiny little orifices in that nozzle.
Yep. Very good.
Hey, Tony, can you see my screen at all?
Yes, sir. We're seeing your screen. Yes.
Yeah, good. So this is one thing I like to point out in the beginning is really how much are we trying to fix with a diesel engine? And diesel engines actually, emit a very, very small amount of pollutants out that tailpipe today. We're trying to narrow down on really like less than 1% or 0.09% of bad pollutants out the tailpipe. Most of it's made up of, oxygen, nitrogen, CO2, and water. But the CO2, the HC is a very, very small amount. We can oxidize a lot of that with our DOC. And the NOx is kind of a trade-off with particulate. So we see those two figures there. So if we enrich in the mixture, you mentioned earlier that 2,500 degrees is always that key number everybody, chimes in on, where NOx is created at a very, very large increase at that 2,500 degrees, which in a diesel, 2,500 is not hard to make in a diesel engine, of course. But when we started leaning the engines out, what we did was we heated up that combustion chamber even more. If we go richer, we can actually decrease the NOx level. So it's a trade-off between particulate and NOx that we're putting out of the engine. So we don't want it super lean to where we create even more NOx than the SCR can take care of that. And we don't want to go the other way where the DPF gets plugged up from too much particulate as well. So it's kind of a balancing act for any manufacturer to figure out where that balance is in order for the after-treatment system to resolve those issues. So no matter how high it gets, we talked about how much is going out of there, we should be able to do almost double what the allowable limits are with that after-treatment. And that's how they determine the size of the after-treatment components that are on there and how much step fluid they're dosing and so on to make sure that we never go above those allowable limits. Another thing that we got to keep in mind too is sulfur, SO2 that we have here. And there's a kind of, I got some question marks there on undetermined amount of numbers because we still do have sulfur in the fuel. What are we down to now, Tony? 15 parts per million in ultra
yes.
sulfur. So that little bit of sulfur poisons those catalysts, and we got to do a burn off on that as well. And not too often can you smell it in a diesel engine, but a lot of times you can smell it in gasoline engines if you're in an area with some steep grades or so. When vehicles are going up and pulling a load, especially, it'll burn that sulfur off, and you can get that rotten egg smell. But we still have to go through that process because of the small amount of sulfurs that are in the fuel. And that's actually one of the things that gets confused with sulfur is to get that sulfur out of there, they have to burn the sulfur off at very high temperatures. Well, in the process of that, what they do is they burn off other components that are in there, the light metals that are in the diesel fuel, ions, coppers, and so on in that fuel. And those little particles were actually the lubricant, not the sulfur as much as those particles were the lubricant in diesel fuel. I mean, these particles are very, very minute, but they did act as sort of a ball bearing to make lubricant work inside the fuels themselves. So to burn that off, we lose some of that lubricant in that fuel itself. And that's another thing that, isn't really mentioned is the maintenance of the vehicle. What are we putting in it for oil? What are we putting in it for fuel? All that stuff has an effect on this after-treatment system. Are you using the correct oil, low ash oil and things like that? And the diesel fuel with the biofuel, For instance, if you use biofuel at 10%, it increases the service oil interval change on a vehicle. I mean, not quite, but almost in half of the oil interval change services on them. So those are things to keep in mind. Are people servicing their diesel properly when they use, you know, different types of oils and fuels or whatnot in those engines as well?
Yep.
So we talk about, you know, contamination of fuel. This is one picture here where we show where there's contamination inside the diesel fuel injector, which happens with abrasives inside there, particles that are too big to really flow smoothly and lubricate. It's going to cut a channel inside this injector that we see here on the left-hand picture. And on the right-hand side, we see a particle that actually plugged it up inside there. These orifices are very, very small and tiny. So they get plugged up very, very easily, you know, in that injector that we have there. So again, going back to the engine side of it, before we even get to after treatment, we need to make sure that that engine, you know, is performing properly. We're not overfueling or underfueling. We got correct cylinder contribution, IMA codes, if it has an IMA code, that they're put in correctly so it knows exactly how to adjust that fueling. And that's, I think, one of the reasons they're getting rid of IMA codes on a lot of diesel engines is they're going to let the computer take over and realize what that contribution is and then be able to adjust it on its own, because IMA coding is a challenge sometimes and it doesn't get inputted, maybe not correctly or at all, when technicians are replacing components. Now, most of the time it'll set an engine light, but a lot of these operators really don't, you know, bother with check engine lights. If it's running, they'll keep driving it as well. Another thing to keep in mind too is the type of industry that these diesel engines are in. Some of the classes I do is for the passenger bus industry. So school buses is one of them, that these buses don't reach that time to allow the after treatment system to get up to temperature. So you really need a good 30-minute drive over 60 miles an hour to get that after treatment system to do a good regen on it. But you get a school bus, how often does that happen? Very, very rarely does that happen in those conditions. So another thing to look at when you're looking at your after treatment system. And I kind of just broke one down here, an after treatment system, to lay this all out and really look at it. So what's the best way to tackle the diagnostic on this after treatment system? And if you can understand the temperature relationship from each component, is probably going to be your best bet. If you know the temperature difference from one temperature sensor to another, you can pretty much determine if that component is doing its job and working properly for most cases. So let's just take the first one, for instance. The key temperature of that first oxygen sensor in front of the DOC is about 550 degrees, give or take a few degrees per manufacturer. But what will happen if it doesn't reach that temperature? And the answer to that is you're not going to get hydrocarbon dosing in order to increase that temperature in a medium heavy duty or even in the light duty through the cylinders. So that DOC, if it gets hit with fuel and it's not hot enough to have its own flame front internally inside that DOC, it's not going to burn up inside there completely or at all. And that raw fuel is going to go downstream and contaminate the rest of the system downstream as well. Other things that contaminate these systems, we talked about it. Biofuel is one of them. With blow-by, we talked about the blow-by that will contaminate because it's going to go through there. You're going to get some blow-by no matter what. And then the oils that are in the engine itself, the incorrect oil will contaminate it. Antifreeze, another thing that will contaminate it. A lot of times we will get overheating on the DOC and that we can crack the DOC or even melt it down as well. And that will continue downstream to the DPF, and depends on the order of the DPF SCR. Most of the time we see DPFs in front of the SCR a lot of times, but they can reverse that as well. It doesn't matter what order they're in. They can still work together. As a matter of fact, a lot of the medium heavy duty are going to one box systems where these components are actually in one substrate now where they combine them all together. So we're going to have an SCR DPF all in one unit, and the DOC would be in the front of that contained. So we can do all this within one component now, to where we don't have to worry about having multiple components in a line downstream on our vehicles now. Of course, it comes at a price, I'm sure, because it'd be more costly to put all these together and have them work together. But however, you can put them in a smaller area. And the reason why that's probably more focused on medium heavy duty is the real estate is limited to cab and chassis. They don't know what's going to be put on the back, so they need to make it compact, just in case when it rolls off the line that frame is going to be cut down and made, a short box truck or something. They need to make sure they have the real estate to fit that after treatment system underneath the vehicle itself. So that's kind of the idea of the one box system that they're coming out with out there. So any questions so far from anybody?
I don't have one. Anybody?
Karl, I do see one thing on this slide, and I realize it's just an illustration, but is there in the medium and large truck coolant going to the actual after treatment injector like there is in some of the DEF application injectors? I'm just seeing that in this slide. Yeah,
there is some applications. Most of your light duty stuff, your GM, Chrysler, and the Dodge Ram, and the Ford Super Duties are air cooled, and even your passenger cars are air cooled. But when you get into medium duties, probably a 450, 550 and up, they will water cool these. That's a great question, Matthew. And again, we'll talk about this a little bit. We used to see this before without after treatment on the vehicles. We could determine almost what was wrong with that diesel engine performance-wise running when we see black smoke or the white smoke. We know it's unburned fuel. Gray smoke would be oil. Of course, black smoke would be partially burned fuel. But we don't see that as much anymore unless there's a real serious problem. And the reason why the after treatment system is going to absorb that and do its job in order to take care of that. I mentioned earlier, it's 2 times the amount that it can work. It's really not worked very hard until there is a problem, but it can do 2.5 times, 2 times that work that's in there. So a lot of times we can have an engine problem and it can be emitting smoke, but we're not going to see it out the tailpipe. And like you said, Tony, disconnect that exhaust and see what's actually coming out of that. Is there smoke coming out of there? And is it after treatment system working overtime to get rid of that smoke within that system? So one of the things too is we always talked about, this is one thing I always like to do, is talk about the relationship of fuel pressure and volume, because a lot of our systems out there rely on a supply pump that is going to supply the high pressure pump for the systems. And one of the questions I have for everybody here is going to do a little demonstration. And this is on a gasoline vehicle, but it still proves out the relationship between pressure and volume. So this illustration here shows we have 47 PSI and probably about a half a gallon a minute of fuel at 13.5 volts. So if I were to lower the voltage down, which would decrease the speed of the pump, the electric pump, what would happen? Would my pressure drop and my volume stay the same? Would my volume drop, pressure stay the same, or would they both drop together? Does anybody want to chime in on that and give me an answer?
Ready? They're very shy crowd sometimes.
Bueller. So this is kind of one of those things that is important to know when you diagnose, especially the fuel system, because a lot of the data we get is going to be a pressure switch, right? So we're going to get pressure to the scan tool, typically mounted for the low pressure side on, up towards where it's heading towards the high pressure pump to feed that high pressure pump. So if we look at it, we drop a half a volt. What happens here? The pressure stays at 47 PSI, but we did drop down our volume a bit, right? So let's go down another half a volt and our volume is dropping down even more. So pressure is still the same. So at what point will that pressure start to drop in accordance to the volume? And if you said almost near the bottom, you're absolutely right. You can see that pressure pretty much stayed the same. It might have dropped 1 PSI. It's kind of tough to see. It's an eye chart there. Zoom in on a little more for you there. So we dropped down 1 PSI, and you can see right down in here. Let me try to pull up a laser pointer if I can. You can see right down in there, that's where the ball is, and we only drop 1 PSI. So if we're looking at pressure sensors alone and not taking a volume test, we might be looking in the wrong direction if we just think, well, the pressure is good, so I should have enough volume to that high pressure pump supplying that, and we may get lost in our diagnosis trying to figure that out. So another thing to keep in mind, and this all has an effect on the whole system, because if you're not getting enough pressure to the high pressure pump, that's going to affect the overall high pressure of the fuel system as well. So we could get P0087 codes or whatnot that were low on pressure. And if it says that we're not making enough pressure, a lot of people blame that high pressure pump as being the fault. And a lot of times, you know, it gets blamed for no, or replaced for no reason whatsoever as well. All right. So anytime you guys want to break in and ask questions, feel free to, because kind of an open class. I want to give you guys what you want to know about the after treatment system. Anything that you guys are struggling with as well? Like to know that?
Fortunately, most of the people here are the good ones, the ones that should be here and not wanting, but hopefully the ones that are watching the recording are learning. So,
yeah. So this is one of the, this is kind of like a layout of the 2.2 DNOx system that we have out there. This is a medium heavy duty system that we have. However, it still applies very, very similar to the 3.1 and the 5.x that we have out there, and also the 6.x. So what happens with this one is, you know, we have our ignition key on and off, and I'll take you back through it. When this ignition key, it's going through its shutdown cycle right now. It's kind of quick. May be able to pause this when we get back through here. So what happens here is when we go through, we're going to turn on the ignition switch. And what we're going to do is we're going to do basically a prime on this system. And we're going to, let me just make sure I get this queued up here. Let me pause it. Yeah, so turn our ignition switch on, and we're going to run our pump here on the left-hand side. This is our switching valve here. We're going to pull it from the tank. This is going to be our DEF fluid coming up from the tank through our pump, down through our lines, and then we're going to go through this relief valve here for overpressurization. This particular system, I think, runs at about 134 PSI. It'll run through the filter, check our pressure here, and then run up through to our dosing valve itself. So as we're running this here, we're going to fill our lines up. We're going to purge this. We're going to give it a few shots out the dosing valve as well once we get up to pressure, because we want to bleed the air out of here. Now on shutdown, when we shut the key off like we just did, what happens is this 4x2 valve, you can see it moving to the left, just reverses the lines. The pump runs in the same direction. And now what we're going to do is we're going to pull that fluid back out of the lines, the filter, and this whole area, because we don't want to leave this fluid in here. It has a freeze temperature of, I believe it's 12 degrees Fahrenheit. So we want to evacuate these lines. And this is done every single time that the key shut off in any diesel DNOx system out there. And you might want to ask, well, why do they do that? Let's just say the driver gets in, it starts it up in the morning and goes to the store to get a coffee. It goes through this process. Well, it really doesn't have to, but the thing is, the system's not smart enough to know that you're only going for a coffee. It doesn't know that it's going to be shut off for 5 minutes. And its theory is it's going to be shut off indefinitely, and it could meet freezing temperatures at some point. So it doesn't want to leave any fluid in those lines. So this is continually going on all DEF systems out there today. It needs to evacuate these systems clearly to get this out of there. So give you an idea of how that works with the removal of the DEF fluid and the purging of that as well. Let me just see. I'm kind of looking around in some of the slides I have for a few different other things that I'm like to show you.
While you're looking for that slide, if I may say, those of you that work on, for example, I was working on a 2014 Ram Cummins 6.7, you're going to look at the depth pressure with the engine at operating temperature in park, and you're going to find you got 13 PSI. Well, it seems to be referencing an atmospheric. However, though, just note that what can happen is that it will not pressurize as he was shown in the animation until you put it in gear. But once you put in gear, you're going to see the full 72 psi, and it's filling the system at that point. So be aware that Ram Cummins seems to be different than from the other two light duty trucks that, again, they won't prime the system until it's actually in gear. So just be aware of that, because the first time I saw that, I thought I had a bad pump at the beginning. And turns out, nope, that was the normal behavior of that 6.7 Ram Cummins on a 14 model that was working on. So.
Yeah, good to know, Tony. That's I didn't realize that as well. So let's talk a little bit about the DEF fluid, because as with fuel, there's a lot of stuff on the market that has been, I guess it's been out there, but I guess I've been more made aware of it lately, is they're putting additives into the DEF fluid now. And there are companies that are out there that are an additional additive that you can put into the DEF fluid. And I don't know, I haven't done any research. I don't know if it's acceptable or not, but I do know this: if you're just using a common DEF fluid with the 67.5, 32.5%, you should be good to go. I don't know of any need for any additives, unless there's some extreme conditions that I'm not aware of that they may go through. But one of the things that you got to keep in mind is the length of time that that fluid is good for. So it's a probably about an 18-month shelf life, as long as it's stored in the correct location. Sunlight is one of the conditions that breaks this down. So we want to keep it out of the sunlight. And I go to truck stops occasionally. I'll visit them, and guess where they keep the DEF fluid? In the front windows, big bay windows with the sun shining on it. Or a lot of shops will keep the 200, 250 gallon tank outside of their bays, out in the elements, and the sun shining on it as well. So it depends on how much you're using. It could dramatically cut the life down of that fluid as well. And the storage temperatures, depending on where you live, it works best between 23 and 77 degrees. And so if you can keep it around that temperature. But one thing to keep in mind is, what industry are you working on that has DEF fluid in it? So I talked about the passenger bus industry, that the buses sit all summer long. So when they fire those buses up in the fall, what happens is, now that fluid's been sitting in there for 3 months sometimes, and that fluid can degrade over time. So similar to diesel fuel, it ages, and the same thing does with this DEF fluid, it ages as well. And a lot of times what we tell people, if you get a DEF quality code, probably better off just to drain the tank, refill it with fresh fluid, and clear the code and send it on its way. Hopefully it doesn't come back on you. But a lot of times the quality sensors are just contaminated from inferior quality DEF fluid, from being either just slowly added to a little bit at a time, or a long time of sitting with the DEF fluid. And also another thing too is to clean off the dosing module as well. If you can, when you're servicing a vehicle, if you can get at that dosing valve, take that off and just spray the inside of that dosing valve off, get the corrosion that's built up on there. A lot of times just a squirt bottle with water in it will clean that all off of there, but it keeps that dosing valve spraying correctly into the decomposition tube to make sure it sprays properly and atomizes correctly through the SCR. They even sell these fancy little tools here as well. This is an OTC one to check the quality of the DEF fluid, which is also a good idea to verify it with the onboard sensor. A lot of them today, most everything has a quality sensor in the tank itself, but it's also a good idea to check it to verify that they match one another. So you have the correct, the quality sensors working correctly in the tank is what I'm trying to say. And then also, I don't know how this can happen, but it does. DEF fluid in the diesel fuel, or vice versa, diesel in a DEF tank, it does happen. So there are, test strips that are out there to check for any oils that are in the DEF tank itself. I'd probably rather see diesel fuel in my DEF tank. You probably have a better chance of cleaning that out without too much harm, as long as you don't dose it too long to get that out of there, and it's not a big amount. But it's probably worse off if you get DEF into the fuel system, the diesel fuel system. And I don't know who named this stuff, but diesel exhaust fluid and diesel fuel, those names are just too close to one another to have a regular consumer look at those caps and try to figure out what goes in where. And then on top of it, guess where they put a lot of those fills? They put them right next to one another. It makes it even worse.
Yep. And by the way, those of you watching, I recommend a company called dieselcraft.com that sells those test strips, because like Karl hit it right on the money, is that you'd be surprised how many systems have diesel in the DEF. So scary.
Yeah. And, why I'm mentioning this too, SCR performance codes are notorious. It's like, I think an SCR performance code is like just generic code. It could be DEF fluid. It could be something contaminated in the DEF. It could be a bad SCR, but you got to do a little bit more work with just a performance code on an SCR.
All righty. Good info.
Step one is always checking your quality and, is it contaminated? There's also something called an airless flush. So instead of just draining the tank, filling it back up, you're going to flush the tank with either deionized water or DEF. And any school buses or, hey, this vehicle's just been sitting for a while, it's going to be less expensive for you to do an airless flush and clean that system out and put fresh DEF in versus that's going to be less expensive than a single tow bill. And to answer a question Matthew had on the coolant in regards to the DEF. So there's a coolant control valve, and the coolant is actually heating the DEF because the freeze point is 12 degrees. So the coolant will run through these tubes to heat the DEF up so it doesn't freeze. Those can stick open. And when DEF hits 120 degrees, it creates ammonia gas and breaks the DEF down. So if you have an issue with your DEF and there's a coolant control valve, you want to make sure that the DEF isn't getting too hot.
Very good. All righty. Karl, anything else you wanted to add?
No, I'm here for questions.
Yep, we're taking questions here. Yep, any questions? All right. Mara, maybe. Oh, you have a question, Matthew?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I guess maybe another time, maybe Karl will have a little more for us on that CP8. Last time we talked about on the fuel system on the 2025 Ram. Maybe another time he can share a little bit more about that.
Let me chime in on this because Karl has he's got powers to be above him, so therefore he's getting first the okay that what he can and can't talk about it. So.
Okay.
So we're going to hold off on that. We did talk about that. So Karl's got bosses over him. So we're going to wait for him to get the okay. So
sure.
Yeah. I am gaining some steam on that too. So I'll have something for you in a month or two on it.
Yeah,
very good.
We'll invite Karl back definitely when he's ready for that. So Mara, we hope to invite you back. And maybe if you'd like to have 15, 20 minutes, whatever, to give us your $20 million input on your after treatment, since you do this on a daily basis. So definitely would like to have you come back. Definitely, because like I said, after treatment is my biggest headache. I mean, time and time again. And Mara, just let me give you my 2 cents worth. The worst job that I used to have as a shop owner was that truck that would come in with a seized motor. In other words, the motor was grenaded. And the thing is, I would quote the customer, this is how many thousands of dollars going to be for a motor. The problem was that I cannot guarantee it's fixed because I don't know what that grenaded motor did to the after treatment. In other words, is there coolant in it? Is there oil in it? That just adds more dollars and cents to it. And that's the reality, So it's like, yikes. It just gets more and more expensive. So do you see cost as a big factor for you guys?
We do a lot of the medium and heavy duty where it's not, Joe Blow that owns a pickup truck that says, I don't want to stick an extra $5,000. It's already how much to, repair their engine. So it's cost is not as big of a deal. It's more of education where you can say, hey, we don't have to replace your after treatment system, but chances are if you don't do it today, you're going to be doing it 2 weeks from now. And then you're going to pay me to diagnose the problem. So it's going to be an increased labor charge. So you're going to probably end up doing it anyways. And if you don't want to spend $10,000 on a repair, then don't own a diesel pickup truck.
Good. All right. Yeah, we'll definitely invite Mara back. She's from Dynex, correct? And we'll definitely have her come back, and hopefully she'll be willing to come to see with us. And those of you watching the recording, you're welcome to put a comment, since this will be uploaded on YouTube. comment on anything, and we'll try to get you an answer back to as well. So, well, I'm just about tapped out on time. We got stuff to do, so everybody's got to go back to work. So, Mara, Karl, and everybody else that was here, we had a few leave already. They had to go, but Vision is going on this week. That's why there's a lot going on there. So the Vision conference going on out there in Kansas. So, anyways, with that, Mara, once again, thank you. Karl, thank you. Matthew, thank you for your comments. All of you that made a comment, I appreciate that. At this point, we will see you pretty soon, actually, since I got training going on the end of the month. We're probably going to do another roundtable rather soon since we're behind them. So with that, thank you, everybody. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. With that, we are signing off, and we'll tell you goodbye. Thank you once again.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.